Hello and welcome, friend. Tonight I'd like to invite you to settle in as we trace the gentle shadows and bright hopes of an old story, one that wandered the hills of Gilead before it ever found the page. We'll listen close to the life of Jephthah, a man marked by promises, battles, and a kind of courage that aches. His story reminds us how the words we choose on days heavy with longing or fear can shape destinies, sometimes in ways we never guessed. If you're here, drawn by the hush of an ancient tale and a longing to rest, I hope you'll pause for just a moment. Leave a message, if you'd like, for others making this gentle journey. And if these quiet stories speak to you, press subscribe and come along with us each night. There's always room by the fire for one more. Let's drift together now to the land of Gilead, a place that sits quietly between wild border hills and soft-shouldered meadows. It's the kind of country where the wind always seems to have something to say. Some days it carries laughter from one house to another, like an old friend telling jokes before supper. Other days it brings news faster than any runner, picking up rumors at the well and scattering secrets at the edge of the fields. Stone homes are tucked into the valleys, patched and patched again by hands that didn't mind a little hard work. You could walk Gilead's narrow paths and hear sheep calling each other by name, watch the olive trees nodding their grey leaves at the sky, or spot children chasing after stray goats, sounding undoubtedly very concerned with their own importance. In Gilead, the marketplace was both stage and theatre. An old woman might sell you onions, along with a story about her childhood. A donkey trader could haggle over a price with enough drama to rival great kings. And above it all, the hills stood watch, pink in the evening sun and wise from seeing so much. Yet beneath the simple routine of sowing and harvesting, another current always ran. Everyone knew everyone's business. Even on the quietest days, nothing stayed hidden for long. You could trip on a pebble at breakfast, and by supper, half of Gilead would know which foot you stumbled on and whether you swore under your breath. There was music in the evenings, sometimes just a flute complaining gently in the dusk, sometimes voices lifted together under a woven sky. The smell of bread baking rose from rough ovens and mixed with the sharpness of wild herbs. Life here was earthy, ordinary, and somehow extraordinary in its warmth. But Gilead was also a place that took measure of its people. Some folks fit like a handmade sandal, others like a stone in your shoe. And then there were the stories, whispered, embroidered, passed along until even the originals would hardly recognize themselves. This is the world into which Jephthah was born, a world of closeness, quiet judgments, and the comfort, or awkwardness, of always being seen. Jephthah's childhood in Gilead was never simple. He was the kind of boy everyone noticed, even if he would have preferred to disappear. With hair always a bit unruly and a knack for collecting stray dogs and bruises, Jephthah learned quickly that some places welcome you and others remind you, pointedly, that you don't quite belong. The gossip in Gilead moved faster than a startled flock. Children sometimes whispered behind cupped hands, while grown folk traded looks over baskets at the well. "That's Jephthah, Gilead's wild branch," someone muttered once loud enough for him to hear. He tried not to mind, but even the bravest boy gets tired of being the punchline to another man's joke. Sometimes he'd catch a group of women who should have known better, pausing mid-laundry to give him that particular sideways glance, reserved for trouble or legend. Jephthah gritted his teeth, grinned sideways, and learned to walk slightly ahead or behind the other children, but never with them. His mother, folks said, was different. Some whispered she was a shadow among respectable women, always coming and going with eyes lowered, fighting the wind and the world. Jephthah knew what the others thought, though he pretended not to care. He told himself, A man is not defined by the shape of his mother's laughter or by what the neighbors think they know. Once, after a particularly cruel taunt, Jephthah squared his shoulders and looked up at the mountain peaks, as if searching for a friend among the clouds. "At least the hills don't talk so much," he muttered, kicking a stone down the path. Still, not every story about him was bitter. Some children, blessed with kinder hearts or shorter memories, would let him join their games. Jephthah was fast and cunning to all elbows and grins, never above sneaking a second helping of figs or crafting wild, impossible stories that left even the skeptical little boys dreaming. He could make a flute from a broken reed and draw birds close with a patient hand. People might have said many things about Jephthah, but no one ever accused him of giving up easily. So the days passed in Gilead, with Jephthah making his way part shadow, part secret, always watched, and always a little apart. There, even a laugh could feel like a question, and every kindness came wrapped in the sharp paper of curiosity. He was a boy who grew up in the space between rumors and reality, learning how to survive, and, occasionally, how to smile in spite of it all. It's hard to understand the weight carried by a child set apart, but in Gilead, history had a way of sticking to a name like burrs on a traveling cloak. They called Jephthah the son of a prostitute whenever a little extra cruelty seemed required. No secret ever stayed buried, and his mother's story trailed after him, whispered into every corner, at the well, along the olive terraces, even in the synagogue where prayers sometimes ran thin against thicker judgment. Being different in Gilead wasn't just a matter of being noticed, it was a daily examination. The other children could see their own faces reflected in their father's laughter and mother's pride, but Jephthah, he only ever heard the old warnings wrapped in fresh voices. "Don't run with that one. He's not our kind." As if a line on a family tree determined whether a boy could sit in the shade or play after chores were done. One especially bright afternoon, Jephthah tried to join a group skipping stones at the river. He'd barely tossed his first rock when a boy, older and especially practiced at cruelty, snickered. Careful he doesn't teach the water to lie to, like his mother. Jephthah's ears burned, but he scanned the current, straightened his shoulders, and replied, just loud enough, "Water trusts anyone with a soft hand. Maybe you should try that sometime." The others fell silent. The river carried on, and Jephthah pocketed the sting for later another ache put away with the rest. His mother stood by him, fierce and quiet. She brushed off the harsh glances, making the little house as warm as she could, baking her hopes into the bread and tucking her laughter into the corners for him to find. There were times, late at night, when Jephthah would pretend the roof over his bed was as steady as any other in Gilead, and the walls would gather around to keep out whatever trouble the village could invent. Adults might shake their heads as he passed, mutter about family choices they would never make, all while tightening the bond of us that never quite included him. If Jephthah ever felt bitterness, he hid it behind a crooked smile and the gentle mischief of a survivor. He learned young how to slip away when the stories grew sharp, how to patch up his hurts with stubborn pride, and how to laugh so it sounded like he meant it. Maybe it was not so much that Gilead refused to let him belong, but that it wanted always to remind him, membership comes with conditions, and forgiveness is best served cold and with plenty of witnesses. Yet even there, under the weight of daily judgment, Jephthah's spirit refused to shrink. The boy made of wild roots and brighter hopes, who learned to carry pain with humor. There was no rumor clever enough to keep him caged. If there was one thing Jephthah's brothers knew well, it was how to draw a line in the dust. They were the sort who excelled at practicing family unity, just as long as it included everyone except Jephthah. Each brother had learned early that the easiest way to gel as a group was to find someone outside it. And if Gilead provided no obvious outsiders, well, sometimes you had to create your own. Around their father, the brothers spoke in careful tones, ever so proper. But when the old man turned his back, their voices sharpened. A stray whisper here, a muttered insult there, always aimed like a pebble in Jephthah's shoe. They'd appear beside him in the field, all wide grins and false kindness. "Not tired yet, Jephthah," one would say. "We wouldn't want you left behind or in front, for that matter." It seemed the only time they turned down a feast was if Jephthah was the guest of honor. One evening, as the lamplight flickered and silence pressed into their shared meal, the eldest couldn't resist. "Our house is for Gilead's true sons," he declared, not looking at Jephthah, but making sure everyone else did. The others nodded, solemn as if approving a royal decree. The implication fluttered through the room like a moth, annoying, persistent, impossible to ignore. Jephthah tried to meet them with a shrug or an offhand joke. "If the table legs start shaking tonight, it's just the house trying to rid itself of bad company," he'd comment, voice dry as barley bread. The brothers exchanged glances, some disapproving, some hiding reluctant smiles. One snorted, "Careful with your wit, brother. Wouldn't want you to cut yourself on it." But the laughter never lasted long. Whenever hard questions arose, division of land, the share of an inheritance, it was clear as day. Jephthah did not count. The law was on their side, or so they said. And though Jephthah sometimes protested, "Is blood not blood? Is a son not a son?" the brothers responded with silence cold enough to freeze river water. Finally, the line they'd drawn darkened into something permanent. With practiced voices, they assembled before Jephthah in the courtyard, as if on trial. "You will not have an inheritance in our father's house," said the eldest, firm and rehearsed. "You are the son of another woman. Go find your fortune elsewhere." For a moment, the youngest looked as if he might speak, a flicker of soft memory crossing his face. But pride is contagious, and a family of men rarely admits regret when the village is watching. So Jephthah gathered what little he had, stood for a heartbeat longer just to make sure his legs worked, and offered one last remark, gentle, almost affectionate. "If you find my share anywhere in the field, let me know. I'd hate for a goat to trip over my fortune." He left them laughing, though even they weren't sure if it was at him or themselves. Sometimes a family pushes you out the door not because you don't belong, but because they're afraid you might prove that you do. So Jephthah left Gilead behind him, walking past fields he had helped plant, stone fences he'd built with brothers now quick to forget. His bag was light, almost insultingly so, as if his life back home could be packed into one evening's worth of bread and a second shirt. The road ahead twisted between olive trees and stubborn grass, every step echoing with the memory of voices that called him outsider and family in the same breath. He tried to tell himself that starting over could be an adventure, that some men might even envy this chance. But the truth itched beneath his skin. It stings to be pushed out before you have anywhere to go. Still, Jephthah walked on, a stubborn line to his shoulders and a half smile tucked away for emergencies. Sometimes he paused to look back, though he pretended he was just straightening the strap of his satchel. The hilltops looked different now from this side, less like home, more like a painting someone forgot to finish. On the way, he passed a patch of wild fennel, and, in a moment of defiance, plucked a stalk for the taste. "At least out here," he mused, chewing thoughtfully, "the weeds don't care who your mother was." A quail burst from the grass, taking his private joke with it skyward. As twilight crept in, Jephthah found himself rehearsing old arguments, retelling old wrongs, as if the air out here cared for his side of the story. He thought of every sneer, every closed door, every meal eaten with the sense that a seat at the table could slip away at any moment. But as darkness settled, Something inside him shifted a stubborn hope, maybe, or the relief that comes from leaving behind a place that never quite fit, the burdens of being unwelcome. The sharp words and sharper glances, they felt a little lighter out where the only judge was the nightly wind. So, with the night stretching ahead and the land wide open before him, Jephthah walked on. His bag was light, but his head and heart were packed much too full. Still, in a world so wide and strange, sometimes the only thing to do is keep moving, step by hopeful step, toward a place not yet invented by memory or rumor. The land of Tob did not greet newcomers with open arms, but Jephthah had never expected any place to do him favors. Tob was rugged, patched with rocks and grass. A place where silence spoke louder than gossip and loneliness was simply the shape of most afternoons. It was a good spot for those who had been pushed aside, and Jephthah soon found he was not the only one with bruises to hide and reasons to keep moving. Here, names were seldom asked for, as if everyone agreed that backstories only made life heavier. A new man could arrive with nothing but a stick and a tired look, and no one would press him to explain. In Tob, survival was introduction enough. Jephthah learned quickly what it meant to be resourceful. There were wild goats to chase down if you were fast, or to wait for if you were patient. He learned how to trade favors for a share in somebody's cookpot, and how to read the clouds so he wouldn't be caught sleeping without a roof during a sudden downpour. He fixed broken fences in exchange for shelter and offered clever advice on how to keep wolves away from nighttime fires. A few even said he could spot trouble coming before the birds went quiet, though whether that was luck or skill, no one was sure, perhaps not even Jephthah. Mind your own wounds, and patch your neighbor's fence if you want to stay warm, an old man told him one evening. Jephthah nodded, and by the second week, he was already almost invisible, which is just the right level of famous in Tob. Meals here were whatever two strangers could scrounge, shared with the sort of laughter that pretends not to be desperate. There was a strong sense among these exiles that tomorrow might not arrive, so every story was just shy of an argument and every cup of water more precious than a handful of coins. But Jephthah did more than just survive. He listened, he watched, and he learned to make a weapon out of his reputation, whispering a threat or a promise, as needed, with the same steady voice he once used to calm runaway goats. No one in Tob asked why he came or where he was headed next. That was a kind of comfort, in a place built for those who belonged nowhere. Jephthah found the beginnings of a life messy, patched together and shaped by hands that knew the value of making do. If not exactly home, Tob was, at least, a place where the past had to walk a little farther to catch up. In Tob, unlikely friendships grew like wildflowers, expected, hardy, and more beautiful for their stubbornness. Jephthah's fire, on most nights, was surrounded by the sort who seemed allergic to quiet. A limping shepherd with more stories than sheep, a potter with clay still under his nails, an archer who claimed he could split a fig from 50 paces but mostly hit his own foot. At dusk, when the wind settled and the world shrank to just the circle of flickering light and the hush between stories, laughter became a language of its own. They shared whatever they could find, sometimes a handful of bitter roots roasted by the flames, sometimes a miracle of rabbit caught in a snare. Someone always managed to produce a skin of wine, somehow never truly empty no matter how many times it passed around. One night, the shepherd told of outsmarting wolves by pretending to be a bigger, angrier wolf. Another time, the potter described the best pots he ever made, none of which survived their first season. Much like my luck, he sighed, and the firelight made the wrinkles at his eyes glow. Jephthah was quiet at first, listening, measuring the way these men brushed up against sorrow, and then quickly brushed it away again. When he did speak, it was with dry humor and sharp observation. In Gilead, people whisper about you. Here, if someone's whispering, it's probably to suggest you pull your weight. More than one face cracked a smile at that, the pain behind it familiar. Stories turned to gentle teasing, the kind that says, "We belong nowhere, and that's not half as bad as people think." Sometimes, after a second round of laughter, silence would settle thicker than the stew. In those moments, Jephthah would poke at the fire and say something simple, like, "Tomorrow we'll need more wood," and somehow the future felt manageable again. One evening, as the stars blinked to life, the archer stretched out and said, "Maybe the stones here judge less than the people over there." Jephthah tossed a pebble into the darkness. "I don't know. I've tripped over enough of them that I'm suspicious." They all laughed then, that deep, smoky laugh of men who know the cost of old injuries and the comfort in new company. The nights in Tob were sometimes cold, but never quite lonely after that. In a world held together by small kindnesses and bigger jokes, Jephthah found a strange kind of family, a band of exiles leaning in, not away, from one another's warmth. Time passed differently in Tob. It slipped by in fits and starts, measured less by seasons than by scars healed and new stories gathered. Jephthah never marked the days with a scratch on a wall or a woven calendar. Instead, he counted the small victories. A fight avoided, a winter survived, a deal struck that didn't end in bruises. Word about Jephthah traveled farther and faster than any of his old enemies might have liked. There were no scribes penning heroic poems, and certainly no town criers or messengers tooting out his achievements. But somehow, everyone came to know of the stranger who led wild men as if he'd trained for it since birth. Perhaps it was just that in Tob, every good story had legs and, apparently, a good sprint. Jephthah had a knack for cool-headed decisions in the heat of trouble. When a merchant's cart was nearly knocked off the road by a careless boulder, it was Jephthah who figured the safest way to haul it up again, with half the effort and a quarter of the shouting. Word spread, "He's clever, that one," and not afraid to get mud on his boots, either. He gained a reputation for settling quarrels, not with fists or threats, but with a look that reminded everyone he'd survived worse insults than those tossed over a pot of stew. Arguments seemed to shrink in his presence, grudges loosened their grip. People started listening not just because he spoke, but because he didn't waste words. You know you've made it in Tob when even the goats show you respect, and Jephthah wasn't far off. One moonless night, smoke from a neighbor's fire threatened the whole camp. Before panic could take hold, Jephthah organized buckets and blankets, shouting directions that cut through the dark like a sharp knife through old bread. The fire surrendered, and so did the last doubts about who was truly in charge when things got difficult. Without even trying, he became a leader one nobody would have chosen, but everyone seemed to follow. It was ironic, the way Tob, a home for outcasts, learned to depend on a man tossed out for not belonging. Jephthah sometimes grinned at the thought, sure that if his old brothers could see him now, they'd choke on their pride or their breakfast. Still, there was never a parade, nor a crown, nor anyone putting up his likeness on a wall. The people of Tob simply trusted him when it mattered most and teased him just enough to make sure it didn't go to his head. After all, Jephthah might not have had a place in Gilead, but in Tob he'd somehow found his crowd even, if they were the kind that would rather wrestle a goat than write a compliment. So, time moved on. Jephthah's legend grew, stitched together by fireside talk and the quiet admiration of those who understood what it meant to scrape a life from the corners, all without so much as a single follower or a public page, just proof that the right kind of respect doesn't need hashtags to stick. Then, Everything changed in the hush before dawn, when fear slithered back into Israel like an old debt collector. The people of Gilead woke to news that made their morning bread taste bitter. Enemies were gathering on the far side of the border. Ammonite men with hard faces and harder swords. It started quietly, as bad things often do. A caravan failed to return. Shepherds spotted shadows moving where sheep should graze. By the time the rumors reached the town square, they had grown long legs and wild teeth. Some insisted the enemy was already taking villages on the outskirts. Others swore up and down the Ammonites were waiting for the harvest, ready to pluck more than just the wheat. Fear spread faster than fire in bone-dry grass. Mothers pulled their children inside at dusk, latching doors with hands that couldn't quite hide the trembling. Elders found their sleep broken by uneasy dreams and imagined hoofbeats. Even the dogs in Gilead, usually so fond of post-supper scraps, started barking at the wind as if it carried bad intentions. Market stalls emptied without a word. Deals were forgotten. Old arguments suddenly seemed a luxury for safer times. Any stranger on the road was met with the kind of suspicion that made even long-time relatives feel unwelcome. The laughter that once tied neighbors together shrank, leaving only anxious glances and sighs hiding behind polite greetings. But as worry thickened in the air, it was not only fear that took up residence. Memories of the past of harsh oppressors, hard years, and desperate prayers rose up in the people's minds. Young men practiced swinging swords in backyards, more for show than skill, but bravado counts for something on uneasy nights. Old men gathered at doorways, passing tales of battles won and lost, each one polished a little brighter or darker with every retelling. Yet, beneath all these rumors and bravado, a common question pressed at every heart: who would lead when the shadows grew teeth? Who would stand when the bravest watched the horizon and saw only trouble coming closer? So, as enemies crept nearer, and the land of Gilead held its breath, hope became a rare and costly thing. People learned again what it means when peace is only as strong as the courage of those who will defend it. And perhaps, just beyond the noise, a few already wondered if the very man they'd once sent away was the one whose absence now stung the most. In the council halls of Gilead, the leaders gathered, faces drawn tight as bowstrings. Their usual talk of crops and taxes faded beneath worry's heavy shadow. This time, the chatter was not about whose goat had wandered off or which well was running low, but whose family would be safe by the end of summer. The anointed men elders, who'd perfected the art of heavy sighs and long pause, shifted uneasily in their seats. For all their speeches and careful grey beards, no one seemed to have an answer worth trusting. Maps were unrolled, and fingers traced borders with far more confidence than anyone truly felt. Each proposal sounded sensible for 3 sentences and impossible by the 4th. Every strategy was met with more head-shaking than agreement. Someone finally said it straight. Our bravest look at the enemy and see their own fear staring back. A silence followed, the air thick enough to slice. Another elder grumbled, "Well, who can blame them? The Ammonites fight like they're chewing gravel, and none of us are eager to be spat out." There was a brief attempt at optimism. Perhaps if we pray harder, or offer more at the altar, one suggested, not sounding convinced. The man beside him offered a hollow chuckle. Unless you're praying for the enemies to suddenly lose interest in land and plunder, I doubt heaven will answer any faster. Bitterness snuck in, as worry will. Some quietly mentioned the names of men who should have stayed, the strong ones driven out over small slights or old arguments. Eyes flickered to empty chairs, each with its invisible shadow. Finally, a woman who'd been quietly listening spoke, upper rarity, but no one stopped her. If we're honest, We've sent away every stubborn, clever man who ever disagreed too strongly. Maybe it's time to admit wisdom doesn't always wear the friendliest face." That comment hung in the air, both a sting and a dare. They all knew what she meant, though admitting it was another matter. And so the meeting stretched, puzzling over the same riddle: how to save a people who could not save themselves, how to call back the one they'd so thoroughly pushed out. In a council chamber thick with the scent of fear and old arguments, desperation finally began to sound a lot like honesty. The elder's pride, clinging as it was, felt suddenly as unhelpful as a broken sandal on a muddy road. The time for fine words had ended. What was needed now was something or someone much sturdier. So, after much arguing and no small handful of wounded egos, a strange solution took root, a plan born not out of sudden wisdom, but out of sheer, practical desperation. The elders and councillors of Gilead looked at one another, each silently hoping someone else would say it aloud. At last, a senior elder sighed the words everyone dreaded and needed: "We could send for Jephthah." The room went very quiet, except for the rustle of someone's sleeve and the hopeful, almost comic gasp from a junior councillor who had once sworn Jephthah would never set foot in the village again. After all this time, someone whispered, disbelief and hope chasing each other across the table. An uncomfortable silence settled in. No one enjoyed remembering the last time Jephthah's name was brought up, usually in the same breath as disgrace or some less than charitable assessment of his parentage. But reality cares little for pride, and the Ammonite army did not wait for personal feelings to be sorted out. "He's no favorite son," muttered another, picking at the edge of a cracked table. "But he never ran from a fight or a fool's errand." There was, of course, the matter of respectability. No one wanted to admit the town's salvation might depend on a man they'd worked so hard to forget. But one by one, the elders weighed the cost. Do nothing, and Gilead would be little more than a fading memory. Swallow pride, fetch Jephthah, and at least stand a chance. Reluctantly, resolve gathered itself in that tired, lamplit room. They began planning not how to defeat the enemy, but how to send a delegation to a man everyone had insisted was better left gone. As they prepared the message, the irony was not lost on a few. One councillor remarked quietly, "I suppose exile looks a little different when you need a hand to lift the sword." Another snorted, "Let's hope he's forgotten how to hold a grudge, or at least remembers how to hold a spear." And so, in the chill of uncertainty, a decision was made. Messengers would go to Tob, hats in hand, humility stitched awkwardly into every word. Their only hope, as thin and fragile as a young vine, hung on a man built from stubbornness and the kind of pain respectable people hope never to understand. As morning crept over Gilead's rooftops, the council scattered, some relieved, some embarrassed, all secretly wishing, just this once, that the outcast would answer when home called him back. The delegation sent to find Jephthah looked every bit as uncertain as they felt. Their robes were travel-creased, their sandals dust-caked, and their expressions held the sort of worry that comes from knowing you're about to ask a big favor from someone you once locked out of the party. When they arrived in Tob, the exiles Jephthah's new crowd watched the strangers approach with the silent skepticism reserved for unexpected guests or men carrying trouble in their pockets. The messengers glanced at each other, straightening their backs and smoothing their tunics, suddenly keenly aware of how out of place they seemed among weathered faces and wary eyes. Someone announced their purpose, voice polite but strained. "We've come to speak with Jephthah of Gilead," he said, as if the name still tasted foreign. The word traveled through the camp until Jephthah himself stepped into view, arms crossed, eyebrow raised, looking as if he'd heard every possible excuse and was prepared for at least 3 more. There was an awkward clearing of throats, a shuffle of toes against the earth. The lead elder bowed a little too formally, considering their last conversation had ended with Jephthah being shown the road. "Peace to you, Jephthah," he began. His voice wobbled between hope and embarrassment. "We come from Gilead, on behalf of your people." He tried to smile, but it flickered like a lantern in the wind. Jephthah looked over the group, every inch the outsider turn leader, and replied with a smile as sharp as a plow blade. "Isn't it something," he said gently, "how the road twists? Yesterday I wasn't good enough for your company, and today I find myself surprisingly popular." One braver counselor stepped up. "Our need is great, Jephthah. The Ammonites threaten everything. We had no choice but to seek your help." His honesty hung in the air, plain and heavy. Jephthah let the silence stretch so everyone could taste it, then shrugged. "No one ever comes all this way just to say hello. What is it exactly you want?" The question was simple, the answer so much harder to swallow. All around, the camp watched, curiosity simmering. Even the men who'd grown tough in exile couldn't help but smirk at the sight of polished elders nervously shifting in the dirt, searching for words that might smooth out old offenses. Under the watchful eyes of the Tob crowd, and with humility now unavoidable, the delegation waited on Jephthah's answer, hoping stubborn history might just be outmatched by even greater necessity. The negotiation between Jephthah and the elders could have taken place in a palace, given the formal airs if not for the chickens lazily pecking at crumbs and the unmistakable scent of last night's stew lingering around the camp. Still, the words were as weighty as any spoken in royal courts. Jephthah, arms folded, measured each elder with a cool gaze. "You've come a long way. Out with it. What makes you think I'd fight for Gilead, after all that's happened?" he asked, plain as day, but his tone held a sting that could have sharpened an axe. The elders shuffled, glancing nervously at each other. The oldest tried first. "We need a leader. If you go with us to battle against the Ammonites, you will be our head all the people, all the villagers. You will judge over us. We'll give you honor, authority, whatever it takes," he promised, piling words like stones, trying to build a bridge over their shared history. Another chimed in, trying for a smile. "It is no small offer. Gilead needs a strong arm and a clever mind. We can't think of any who fit better." His grin faded quickly when Jephthah didn't return it. Jephthah considered their promise. "So, let me see if I have it," he replied, a hint of dry amusement in his voice. "You send me away when life is easy, then come crawling back when there's trouble, and now you want to put me in charge. Just like that. I hope your memory for promises is better than your memory for grudges." One or two of his friends stifled a laugh behind their hands. The elders, faces flushed with the effort of swallowing their pride, nodded. "We are in earnest, Jephthah. We swear it by the Lord. If you fight for us and win, you will rule Gilead. No one will question it, not even the ones who once called you outsider." For a moment, the camp was silent, the villagers' words echoing between the tents and into the past. The crackling fire seemed to punctuate the pause, as Jephthah watched them carefully, not yet ready to offer his trust, but tempted by the bittersweet taste of justice and irony. He could have turned them down just to prove a point, or taken the deal and spit a sarcastic thank you their way. Instead, Jephthah let the offer settle deep, somewhere between his oldest wound and his wildest hope, and simply said, "We'll see if your promises hold up under pressure better than your courage did." And with that, the game was a leader chosen not for his lineage, but for his grit, standing at the edge of home with old ghosts and new power in hand. Jephthah did not agree immediately, nor did he leap for the chance like a man desperate to reclaim an old life. He weighed the offer with the careful suspicion of someone who'd been handed one too many thorns disguised as olive branches. He walked a slow circle around the elders, the camp watching with interest and a good bit of poorly hidden amusement. "So let me understand," Jephthah mused, voice steady. "One day I'm not fit to share bread at your table, and the next you want to serve me the whole loaf with the bakery thrown in." The elders tried to hold their dignity, though nerves danced in their smiles. "Desperate times, Jephthah. You know how things are. There are no better men for the job," one answered, his voice a little too hopeful. Jephthah looked away toward the distant hills, the same hills that had spit him out years before. He remembered his mother's weary laugh, the sting of his brother's words. The long walk out of Gilead. Was a promise from these men truly worth returning for? Or would this new honor be just a shinier form of exile? He sighed and turned back to the elders. "All right, here's my condition. Swear to me before God that if the Lord gives me victory, what you've promised is not just wind and wishes. No arguments when it's over, no sudden changes of heart. I come back, I fight, I led no tricks. No more knife in the back." With faces set in reluctant agreement, the elders raised their hands. "Before the Lord, we swear it. Whatever you say, so it shall be." Jephthah studied their faces, seeking deception, but seeing only exhaustion and relief. He cracked a rueful smile. "I warn you sometimes, the hero you hire isn't the one you'd choose for a dinner guest." But inside, beneath the sarcasm and hard-won caution, a flicker of pride warmed him. After all these years, here he was, no longer the boy pushed aside, but the man whose scars had somehow become his armor. He extended his hand. The elders took it, each grasp firm but uneasy, as if they were shaking on a storm rather than a simple deal. So Jephthah accepted, with a mind clear and a heart that, for the first time in a long while, dared imagine something more than survival. Still, he kept a piece of skepticism close, ready for whatever Gilead's welcome and its memory might have in store. The road back to Gilead was not long in miles, but Jephthah felt every step like a question mark. He travelled at the head of the elders' party, quieter than his companions, his mind stitching together old hurts and new possibilities. The land looked both familiar and changed, as places tend to after too much absence. Olive trees still leaned into the wind, the hills hadn't moved, and yet each bend in the path seemed to offer up a memory, some sharp, some shy, all impossible to ignore. When the party approached the village, word moved ahead of them like a flock of birds stirred from the brush. By the time Jephthah reached the old square, people had gathered, clustering around doors and peeking out from the shade of fig trees. It was a festival atmosphere, with none of the cheer eyes wide, voices hushed, everyone secretly curious to see what the years had done to their lost son. His brothers stood with the other men, arms crossed in practiced unity, but their faces betrayed a tangle of thoughts, pride, regret, and that awkward Gilead talent for pretending you never missed what you threw away. A few women whispered, a couple of children pointed, and one old man squinted, as if hoping Jephthah had come back shorter, out of spite. Jephthah met their gazes with a half smile, the kind that said, "Yes, it's really me. No, I haven't forgotten." His brothers, caught between old habits and new realities, offered nothing but stiff nods. One managed a muttered, "Didn't expect to see you lead a parade," but another, youngest and least certain, just stared, maybe hoping the ground would open up and explain things for him. Neighbors approached, eager for a piece of the story. Some tried on friendly greetings, "Welcome home, Jephthah," as if it were a tunic they weren't quite sure fit. Others hung back, silently measuring the distance between scandal and salvation. Jephthah answered it all with a mix of politeness and wry humor. "Look at that same square, same faces, even the rumors haven't changed much." The crowd chuckled, grateful for the lightness. Still, underneath, he could sense the old doubts swirling. Would he remember every slight? Could a village so quick to judge learn to follow the man they once sent away? For a moment, time seemed to hold its breath, Gilead straining to welcome the leader they never thought they'd need. And Jephthah, in the middle of it all, let himself feel both the ache of old wounds and the odd hope that maybe, if only for now, the door had opened a little wider than before. That night, as the crowd's curiosity melted away with the daylight and families slipped inside to whisper their opinions behind closed doors, Jephthah found himself at the threshold of his old home. If a place that never fully welcomed you could ever be called that. The hearth was the same, right down to the scorch mark near the door, but the feeling was different. This was no boy returning. This was a man with the weight of a whole nation pressing at his shoulders. He washed his hands in cool water, letting his thoughts run like the stream through Gilead's hills. In the hush, Jephthah did what he'd always done in the loneliest hours. He talked to God, not with the formality of a priest, but the marrow-deep honesty of a man who has chewed on loss and found his throat still open to hope. "Lord," he prayed quietly, looking up at the smoky rafters, "here I am. Not everyone's favorite pick, but the only one left in the basket. You know Gilead's heart better than I, do the proud, the fearful, the stubborn, and you know mine, too. I never asked for this, but you put me here. So if you're listening, lend me the strength to lead, or at least the wit to fake it until the dust settles." He knelt, elbows on his knees, head bowed beneath the low ceiling. Outside, a breeze coaxed a shutter to tap tap tap, as though echoing his restless thoughts. Jephthah let the silence speak back, searching for any sign of warmth in his chest, a wordless surge of resolve, even a hint of humor in the way the lamp flickered. "If you want poetry, find a psalmist," he added softly, a tired grin on his lips. "But if you want a fighter, I'm here. Just keep my feet steady, and my mouth from outrunning my sense." Doubt lingered, of course it did, but so did something steadier. Not quite confidence, but the realization that every scar he carried had forged him for this moment. His hesitations became part of the prayer. "Whatever comes, let me face it. If there's wisdom for me, send it quickly. If there's danger, warn me a little sooner than last time." He rose, feeling the old aches in his bones and the peculiar calm that settles when a man has nothing left to prove except to himself and his God. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, armor to strap on, strategies to consider, faces to win and fears to quell. But tonight, Jephthah allowed himself a small comfort, the knowledge that he had come back, yes, but on his own terms, with his faith sharper than any sword, and a sense that maybe, just maybe, he was right where he was supposed to be, with night giving way to a pale, tremulous dawn. Jephthah stared into the shifting light, his heart tugging between the courage expected of him and the secret fear of all that could go wrong. Armor was ready, men were sharpening their blades, and the tasks of a leader pressed in from every side. Yet Jephthah, never one to trust easy luck, felt the old urge to bargain with Havona, desperate thing born deep in the belly when hope and dread mix just right. He stepped outside, letting the cool air clear his thoughts, and walked alone to a quiet place beyond the outskirts. The fields shimmered with dew, untroubled by the worries of men, and the only witness was the wind, curious as ever. Eyes lifted, Jephthah whispered, a promise, delicate at first, then stronger as conviction found him. "Lord, if you will truly give the Ammonites into my hand, if you stand with me when I stand before them, then whatever or whoever comes first out of my house to greet me when I return in peace, I will offer to you fully, no holding back. It will be yours, my word, my vow. It was the kind of promise a man makes with trembling lips, not sure if he's being bold or foolish or both. He remembered every story around ancient fires, warnings about words spoken under pressure. Yet the fear was greater, the fear of failure, of watching his people fall, of being the hero who came home empty-handed. Pressure makes some men silent, but Jephthah, ever needing to speak his heart or risk it bursting, gave voice to the vow as if it might shore up his spirit. Perhaps, somewhere above, heaven paused to shake its head at the bargains of desperate men. Finished, he stood for a long moment in the mist, letting the weight of the vow hang around his neck. There was no flash of thunder, no dove descending, only the cautious stirring of hope and the ache that comes from loving a people who only love you when they need you most. Still, there was no turning back. A promise made was a promise marked, and Jephthah, in that tender, reckless moment, had set his course on faith and on consequences still hidden just ahead in the dawn. The sky was silent Italy, as Jephthah walked back toward camp, his promise trailing behind him like a ribbon that no one else could see. Not a single bird interrupted the morning, as if all of creation had paused to consider what a man's word might really be worth. The dew clung to his sandals, cool and grounding, which was more comfort than the memory of his vow just then. It was a strange sort of irony, really. Here was Jephthah, now commander by popular vote and desperate necessity, promising everything to a god who had, truth be told, heard an awful lot of bargains from men with trouble on their doorstep. Perhaps, if the cedars could have spoken, they would have warned him. Be careful with the first thing that rushes out to meet you. Hope likes to arrive disguised, sometimes in the form of a goat, and sometimes, well, sometimes fate is less obliging. Back among his people, Jephthah felt no lighter for his words, only watched by faces that half believed in him and half doubted he'd ever truly belong, no matter how he fought or led. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same villagers who once whispered unfit now waited for him to bring about a miracle. It would have been funny if it wasn't so tiring. He kept the vow to himself, a promise this wild belonged between man and God, at least until the shouting started. Besides, army life had its own burdens. Soldiers wanted plans, not poetry. They asked how he'd outmaneuver the Ammonites, or how many men he'd need at the gate. Never what oaths their new leader whispered in the chilly space between fear and hope. By night, Jephthah lay awake, with his hands behind his head, considering the weight of one sentence, a few words now fixed in the future, waiting to become either blessing or regret. When morning broke and the camp rose, no one noticed the extra care Jephthah took as he strapped on his armor. No one knew he was reminding himself not just of tactics and arrows, but of a promise that might cost him far more than he'd ever meant to wager. There was no response from heaven, no sign, only the soft hush of a world watching and waiting, and a heavy-hearted man staring toward battle with hope, a hint of dread, and the stubbornness of those who'd learned never to trust easy answers or easy victories. The tension in Gilead thickened as word spread. The Ammonites weren't rumor anymore, they were moving in, real as hungry wolves at the edge of the fold. Every morning, lookouts returned with reports of shadows to the east, dust rising where enemy feet churned the road. Men gathered in tight groups, their talk sharp and hurried, each one glancing over his shoulder as if the hills might suddenly spit out trouble. Jephthah stood among them, maps spread over a table, commanders crowding close. Most had seen enough battles to have scars, but not enough victories to have confidence. One picked at a splinter on the table instead of picking a plan. Another stared so hard at the map, you'd think he could push back the enemy with a squint. "They're coming in force," said the youngest, voice shaky, "and they don't look tired." The tent filled with uneasy laughter. the brittle kind that snaps if you breathe too hard. Jephthah leaned in, voice low but certain. We know their tricks. We know the land better. They're men, not monsters. And if we do this right, they'll be the ones counting their losses. It was a simple speech, no poetry, no fire, just the steady grit of a man who's learned his courage one harsh lesson at a time. Plans were made. Runners were sent to rally fighters, sharpen spears, double the sentries along the river crossing. Jephthah weighed every bit of advice with care, tossing out the foolish and gathering the wise. Never above borrowing a good idea from a young buck even, if he'd rather chew sand than admit it. As word came that the Ammonites were breaking camp and advancing, the mood condensed. Hope and dread tangled so closely that you couldn't tell one heartbeat from another. Jephthah double-checked every detail, his hands steadier than his pulse. He looked out at the army-old shepherds, stonemasons, and a handful of fire-eyed teens who thought battle would make them legends, knowing that war rarely listened to a man's plans, and legends were most often written in scars. Still, outwardly, he showed nothing but determination, giving each man a nod, a word, a reminder that even if Gilead had pushed him out, today he would stand at their center and call them his own. For a brief moment, as they braced themselves, and the dust of approaching armies filled the air, it almost looked as though hope itself was assembling alongside them, stubborn enough to hold the line at least one more day. Inside the makeshift command tent, nerves snapped and buzzed like flies around supper. Jephthah's commanders circled the table, trading nervous jokes and old boasts to cover the edge in their voices. One grizzled old fighter nudged his neighbor and whispered, "How many enemies do you think you could scare off just by smelling this stew?" There was a ripple of laughter, thin but welcome. Someone else added, "If the Ammonites take one whiff, they'll run back to their mothers." It was bravado, mostly habit, born from too many nights waiting for dawn. Pretending courage is as easy as breathing. Jephthah watched them, letting the talk lift the mood for a moment. He knew fear had a place in every camp, but jokes could be as important as swords when darkness pressed tight. One young captain, eager but so green he'd probably still thank an enemy for a decent fight, asked, "Sir, what if they come at night? Do we have a signal?" Jephthah nodded. "If the goats start screaming, that's your signal. If they start cheering, you've mixed up the sides." The tent filled with more laughter, and even the oldest commanders shook their heads and grinned. But in the quiet that followed, doubts surfaced, as they always do. "You sure you trust these men? Some of 'em would rather fight over a loaf of bread than against an army," whispered another leader. Jephthah replied, voice steady, "Sometimes hunger makes a good soldier, and nobody knows how precious home is until someone tries to take it." There was a lunar hush as everyone measured their hopes against the sharp teeth of reality. Outside, the campfires dotted the hillside, each flame casting its own little spell of warmth and courage against the growing dark. In the end, Jephthah met every question, every quip, and every doubt with that same dry humor and grim certainty. Sleep if you can, or at least act like it you'll thank yourself tomorrow. If fear was the Ammonites' greatest weapon, Jephthah meant to blunt it with laughter, stubbornness, and the promise that at least when Gilead's fate was decided, they wouldn't face it with their heads down. So the jokes kept coming, loosening nerves just enough as the soldiers cleaned their weapons and tried not to look too long at the horizon where tomorrow's battle was already waiting. At first light, the air snapped with movement, the kind that turns every breath sharp and every sound into a warning. Soldiers tightened their sandals, knuckles pale around spears, while Jephthah walked up and down the lines, giving a word here, a pat on the shoulder there. No grand speeches, just steady eyes that told even the most anxious farmer, "You're part of this. You matter." Behind the low stone walls, men crouched, peeking at one another like boys plotting mischief. A few brave souls tried humming a tune from home, but it tangled in their throats. Somewhere down the row, a would-be comedian whispered, "Well, if I die, let it be after breakfast." His friend grinned. "If you die before breakfast, I'm taking your portion." Quiet laughter traveled with the morning breeze, half nerves, half hope, all human. The horizon was bruised purple with waiting, ammonite banners pricking the sky. Jephthah studied the land, every stone and thicket memorized in his exile years. He picked his ground with a shepherd's patience, not a hero's haste. If a fox could run through it, so could a frightened foot soldier. As the enemy approached, heavy and loud, there was a strange defiance in the Gilead camp. Some men gripped their weapons so tight they might have snapped them in two. Others stared up at the sky as if encouraging heaven to mind its business and let Gilead handle things for once. Jephthah moved to the front, armor creaking, eyes shrewd and searching. He didn't shout or wave a flag. Instead, he leaned in to the men nearest him and murmured, "I'd rather be tired and alive tonight than famous and gone. Let's try for both, shall we?" A ripple ran through the ranks, chins lifted, boots dug in. Farmers squared their shoulders as if they'd been born to this. When the order came, it wasn't a roar, but a stubborn, quiet surge forward like a field of wheat bowing to the wind, then straightening again. The old and the young, hopeful and hesitant, stepped out together into the rising chorus of dust and defiance. No magic tricks, just ordinary people facing down fear, side by side, with hope that refused to stay home. And that is how the battle dawned for Jephthah's people, with jokes at breakfast, grit in every heart, and a leader whose courage fit them like a well-worn boot. The battle itself was not a tidy affair. No song would ever capture the confusion, 1,000 feet pounding, dust blinding good eyes, and the sound of clashing iron drowning out every careful plan. Orders shouted at sunrise got tangled by the time they reached the end of a muddy trench. A donkey, of all things, broke free and charged through the middle of it all, scattering warriors who'd have gladly faced swords, but not an angry, braying animal. Jephthah fought like a man with something to prove, every motion sharp with purpose, but never showy. He slipped through chaos, barking a command here, catching a frightened recruit there. More than once he pulled someone up by the collar, only to add with a wink, "Next time, duck left. Right is already crowded." The Ammonites came strong, loud, and sure. But they'd underestimated the stubbornness of people who knew what exile was like. Gilead's fighters had the look of men who'd lost too much to give up their ground for free. Even the oldest farmers, who had more stories than teeth, swung sticks and shouted louder than the lot. There were moments of real panic. A section of the line sagged. A wild-eyed Ammonite almost broke through. But each time, someone stepped forward, their strength borrowed from the fellow at their shoulder. Jephthah himself waded right into the thick, swinging his blade and cracking jokes with gritty bravado. Swift feet win battles and dinner both move, unless you want to eat dust, he called, earning tired grins, even from men in the thick of it. Every so often, he glanced skyward, just to see if heaven might offer a nordor, even a sarcastic clap from the clouds. But the sun kept its secrets, and so did the outcome for a long while. Still, grit and luck kept finding their mark. At a desperate moment, a clever slingshot took out an Ammonite captain, and suddenly hope sprinted through the Gilead ranks, faster than an untied sandal. By midday, the tide shifted not because any hero stood spotless, but because ordinary people kept refusing to quit. A rumor started that Jephthah was in 3 places at once, scaring the enemy and inspiring faint-hearted cousins who'd never swung a sword except to chase goats. Victory was neither swift nor easy, but as afternoon slouched toward evening, Gilead's stubborn hope outlasted the fiercest storm. Jephthah, dusty, bruised, and just a little out of breath, looked across the field and saw not just survivors, but unlikely winners who'd found their courage the hard, honest way. As the last of the enemy broke and ran, a strange hush swept across the battlefield. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if uncertain whether it was allowed to celebrate yet. Then, bit by bit, laughter and shouts began to ripple out from behind battered shields and weary faces. Men stumbled to each other with grins lopsided by exhaustion, some hugging, some just slumping together in grateful relief. Someone waved a helmet high, declaring it a trophy, only for another to point out that it likely belonged to the loudest snorer in camp. "Let him try sleeping without it tonight, and see who wins then," came the reply, and even those too tired for much talk managed a smile. Jephthah stood at the edge of the field, armor dented and cloak dusty, letting the moment wash over him. He watched as old grudges were forgotten and quick friendships sealed with a slap on the back or a half-shared biscuit. There were a handful of tears, though most men blamed them on the smoke or dust, anything but relief. No horn sounded a grand victory march. Instead, the sound that marked the end was the collective sigh of an entire people, heavier than drums, warmer than music. Jephthah walked among his fighters, offering a word here, a clap on the shoulder there. Some thanked him with the automatic, "Yes, sir," of those still surprised by success. And one jokester managed, "If I'd known winning felt this sore, I'd have lost quicker." The sun dipped low, lighting up the victorious faces, turning sweat and blood into proof that hope can endure beyond what seems possible. For the first time in a long while, Gilead saw its own strength patched together from outcasts and doubters, quick wit and steady hands. As evening curled itself around battered tents and campfires flickered back to life, the weight on Jephthah's shoulders eased just a little. For tonight, at least, peace had returned, and as quiet descended over the land, the people of Gilead let themselves believe that even through loss and laughter, they might yet find their way into gentler days. Returning to Gilead after the battle was nothing like Jephthah had imagined during lonely nights in exile. The road that once sent him out now welcomed him back with wild, ragged cheers. Crowds gathered at the city entrance, pressing close with bright eyes and hands eager to touch the man who had turned fear into victory. Children darted through the throng, waving branches, pretending they were swords and spears. A group of tired soldiers, their uniforms barely holding together, started a chant that faltered halfway. No one quite remembered the old songs of celebration, so they invented new ones, mostly off-key but sung with true hearts. Old neighbors, who not so many seasons ago had spoken Jephthah's name with a wince or not at all, now reached for him, their words and faces awkwardly warm. "Welcome home, Jephthah. You did it, boy." Even his brothers, stiff but sincere, offered claps on the back and nods that almost passed for acceptance. Someone handed Jephthah a small loaf, fresh from the oven, a quiet apology for cold shoulders past. The sight of his people, laughing, embracing, and grabbing at hope like children at a feast nearly undid him. For a moment, weariness faded, replaced with a deep, humming gladness that ran from his hands up to his chest. Among the crowd, a few stood apart, those who still remembered old gossip or found forgiveness a dish best served in tiny bites. But even they could not help but marvel at the way Jephthah wove through the people, neither soaking up the praise nor shrinking from it, simply belonging in a way he never had before. One grey-haired woman, her voice raspy with years, shouted, "Well, I'll be Gilead's goat is now its lion." The laughter that followed rolled right through him. healing more wounds than any speech could have. As Jephthah stood at the city's threshold, home in 1,000 new ways, he allowed himself to believe at least for this evening that victory could give back some of what was lost, and that every exile's road might one day double as a hero's welcome. Jephthah made his way through the swirling joy of the crowd, every step carrying him closer to the quiet edge between victory and home. Behind him, celebration danced in the air, children's laughter, the crackle of loaves being broken, old neighbors daring to call him by endearments they hadn't used since boyhood. Yet ahead, the road narrowed, stretching from the city gates to his own door, every stone and shadow suddenly heavier than before. He walked slowly, not savoring the attention, but feeling the weariness wrap around his ankles like the memory of old chains. Each familiar tree and worn fence post greeted him as if testing, "Are you truly back? Are you truly changed?" A few people lingered at a respectful distance, unsure if a returning exile still knows the way home, or if home itself can make room for a man no longer quite who he was. With every step, Jephthah's thoughts shifted from battle to the vow he'd whispered in desperation, the promise to give to God whatever, or whoever, first greeted him at his door. It was the sort of thing a man says with hope that the future will be kind, or at least predictable. Now, with the scent of bread mingling with the heaviness in his chest, he wondered if destiny paid much heed to a soldier's worries. His sandals scuffed the dusty path, his heart leaning forward and then bracing back, suspended between longing and dread. Behind him, the cheers faded, replaced by the quieter pulse of nervous expectation. For all the glory and relief of triumph, it was this simple walk home, silent but for the echo of a promise that almost undid him. He felt an urge to pause at the garden gate and turn back just for a breath, just to delay the answer waiting on the other side. But home has a way of drawing you in, especially on the edge of evening. Steeling himself, Jephthah walked up to his own front door, each step an unspoken prayer that what met him would be ordinary, merciful, easy to surrender. And all the while, the world seemed to wait with him, holding its breath as if it too remembered what had been promised in a moment men would rather forget. The door swung open before Jephthah could even raise his hand. Out rushed his only child, his daughter, moving with a joy that poured across the threshold like sunlight. She was dancing, truly dancing, arms wide, feet bare, laughter unguarded. The way children dance when no one is watching and all the world is promise. She was singing too, her voice bright and sure, a welcome home song woven from hope and relief and all the music that had been bottled up since the day her father left. She leaped straight into his arms, as if she'd never doubted he'd come back, as if war and loss and loneliness had been just bad dreams for braver men than her own. For a moment the world spun soft and slow, Jephthah holding his daughter, the two of them turning in the fading light like the last bright leaves caught in a gentle breeze. Neighbors paused at the edge of the yard, some smiling, some blinking away tears, all caught in the strange wonder of this welcome. "Father, you've returned as you promised," she cried, and there was nothing guarded in her eyes, only trust and delight. She pulled him by the hand to the middle of the courtyard, urging him to join her celebration. "You are home, you are safe." Jephthah's heart lurched. He remembered his vow, felt every word dropped cold and heavy into his chest. The joy on his daughter's face, her laughter, these felt like light pressing against the darkness, gathering inside him. For a heartbeat, he was just a father wrapped in his child's embrace, wrapped in songs and sunlight and the scent of bread from his own hearth. And then the memory of his promise flickered between them, sharper than any wound. Even the birds seemed to hush in the olive branches above as father and daughter spun in that golden moment, one holding on, the other holding nothing back at all. Around them, the village world kept still, every heart quietly hoping that joy, for once, might be allowed to finish its dance. The moment stretched, growing heavy with a sorrow no celebration could hide. Jephthah froze in the courtyard, happiness fleeing his eyes as the whole world seemed to tilt and hush. His arms loosened their joyful hold, and he stepped back, searching his daughter's bright face with a look that startled everyone nearby. She, still catching her breath, didn't notice at first, busy with laughter and clinging to his hand as if she could pull him right back to their old life. But the change in her father was swift and unmistakable. His shoulders slumped, and his face, sunlit a moment ago, was suddenly bleak as empty fields after harvest. He sank to his knees, voice breaking. "Oh, my daughter." The crowd shrank back, uncertain and afraid, sensing something went very wrong, but only Jephthah knew just how wrong. His daughter crouched close, voice gentle. "Papa, what is it?" But he could only cover his face and groan, the sound raw as grief and regret mingling in the open air. Neighbors exchanged glances, whispers flurrying at the edges of the yard. Someone said softly, "He's weeping over victory," but others, watching Jephthah's trembling hands and the stunned look in his eyes, guessed there was more beneath the surface, a battle still being fought inside a man who just returned home. Jephthah finally looked into his daughter's eyes, tears streaking dust down his worn cheeks. "You have brought me lower than all my troubles," he said, the words tumbling out like stones. "You are the first to meet me, and I made a vow to the Lord, a vow I cannot break." His voice fell to a whisper, a promise that now takes from me the very heart I fought to recover. In that moment, the day's joy drained away, and all that was left was the echo of a father's broken spirit and a daughter's bewilderment, as hope, love, and sorrow spun tight in the last of the evening light. As she took his shaking hand in hers, she was quiet for a stretch, fingers weaving comfort into his palm. Around them, the evening trembled, waiting for her answer. "Father," she said softly, her voice as calm and clear as a mountain spring, "you made a vow to the Lord. That is not a small thing. If your heart aches for me, know that my heart aches too, but I would not have you turn away from what you promised, not even for my sake." A faint, wry smile touched her lips. "After all, you didn't win Gilead by running from hard things, did you?" She squeezed his hand, steady in a way that made the older women dab at their eyes and the men stare at their feet. "You did what you thought was right. Even now, I am proud. If grief is the price of keeping faith, then let it be honest, not hidden. We shall not be afraid." Jephthah's tears fell freely. There was sorrow, yes, but also a new awe for this child, so much braver than the world had ever allowed her to show. For a long moment, they knelt side by side, a father learning just how strong his daughter's spirit was, and a daughter holding her father's heart with a tenderness light could barely touch. His daughter sat quietly with him, hands gentle on his shoulders, as if trying to lend him her steadiness. In the hush, she searched her father's weary face, saw all the sorrow etched into it, and did something no one in the crowd expected. She smiled soft and sad, but real. "Father," she said, voice steady despite the tremor that wanted to break through, "you made a promise, not out of carelessness, but because your heart longed for home and safety for our people. I am not angry with you, not now, not ever. Some things in this life are heavier than one person can carry, but we do not have to meet them in shame or fear." The sun slipped lower, painting her face in golden light. She took his hand and squeezed it, letting her courage steady them both. "If this is the cost of faith, then let it be paid with dignity. You stood for our people, Let me stand now, too. A quiet rippled through the onlookers as her words settled in. Even the gossips, even the hardest hearts, felt something gentle press closer kind of awe. Or maybe just the hope that pain faced bravely becomes a different kind of legacy. She knelt beside Jephthah and lifted his chin with a child's tenderness. I am your daughter, she whispered, yours in joy, and now, even in your sorrow, we will do what must be done. And when stories are told, let it be known I did not flinch from faith or love, not even when the world demanded both at once. The wind picked up, scattering olive blossoms around them, as if nature itself wanted to soften the moment. And though a father's heart broke anew, he saw in his child a strength that would echo far beyond Gilead, willful, pure, and marked by the rare music of acceptance. For a long while, Jephthah and his daughter sat close, their heads nearly touching, father and child drawn together by the weight of words too old for comfort. The village faded into the hush, every neighbor giving them space that was both respect and helplessness. What comfort can you offer when love and duty have become the same impossible thing? Jephthah whispered, broken but clear. I would trade every victory for a different promise. I would give all of Gilead back, just to see you free of sorrow. His voice wavered like a candle before sleep. Forgive me, my child. If I had known... She squeezed his hand a little tighter, her voice unwavering. Some things, father, not even a judge, can see before the sun rises. I do not blame you. We are not always given gentle choices, only the chance to meet them with truth. He brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture as old as her childhood. I never meant to hurt you, not for any kingdom, not for any vow. She smiled, small and brave. You did not choose this pain, nor did I, but I choose to honor what you promised. If I must walk this path, let me walk it bold. Let the world remember. Jephthah's daughter was not taken, she answered. Around them, the garden was still, the air as soft as memory. Jephthah rested his forehead on her shoulder, overwhelmed by her calm. You are a better soul than I ever hoped to raise. I wish my faith had spared you, but I am proud beyond words. Looking up, she returned his sorrow with her own gentle resolve. Then, let what remains between us be love, and nothing left unsaid. The Lord brought you home when all seemed lost. That is enough for me. Their words, both grief and blessing, passed softly between them, weaving a final, invisible braid of hope, regret, and the quiet, brave dignity of those who do not run from the truth. As dusk crept gently over the courtyard, Jephthah's daughter stood and wiped her eyes with the hem of her sleeve. She took a deep breath and turned to her father, who watched her as if memorizing every soft edge of her face, knowing he'd need these memories more than ever. Father, she spoke, careful and measured, allow me this one kindness. Let me go up into the hills for 2 months with my friends. Give me that freedom so I may weep for what might have been and say farewell not in sorrow only, but in gratitude too. Let me have this time apart to honor what I am leaving as well as what you have promised. The crowd heard her words and, for the first time, seemed to understand the peculiar strength that ran in her veins. A few mothers pressed their hands to their hearts, recognizing something sacrificial and luminous in this young woman, something that gentled even the curiosity of old gossips. Jephthah nodded, unable to trust his voice. The ache of letting go wrestled with a gratitude deeper than grief, gratitude that his daughter could meet fate with such dignity, and that she asked not for escape, only for the gift of time. He managed to speak, his words rough as gravel, yet gentle. Go, my child. Take your days in the mountains in. Laugh. Remember. Let your friends carry your burdens for a while. Return when you are ready. and whatever must be done will be done with you, not to you. She reached out and kissed his cheek, tears mingling with a brave, crooked smile. "Thank you, Father," she whispered, "for seeing me, not just the vow. I will come back, I promise." And with that, under the tender twilight, Jephthah's daughter gathered her closest friends and set out for the wild hills' last free journey, a bittersweet pilgrimage, 2 months to dance, mourn, and say goodbye to youth, to ordinary days, to every light-footed morning that might have bloomed. The world watched her go, marked by both sorrow and admiration, as courage traced her steps up into the quiet, watching hills. The hills received Jephthah's daughter and her friends with arms wide as the sky. Out under the open air, sorrow felt different, sharper, yes, but somehow softened by wildflowers and wind. Her friends walked beside her, every step a quiet promise that she would not carry her sadness alone. They wandered the mountain trails, letting the ache spill where the only witnesses were rocks and stars. Some nights were thick with weeping, voices mingling as each girl offered the comfort she could shoulder, a song or memories only friends ever bother to remember. But there was laughter, too honest and unexpected. They made fun of each other's wilderness hair, argued over who snored loudest, and dared each other to chase goats or climb steep slopes just to make the sky feel closer. In the hush before dawn, secrets traded hands like smooth stones, lost dreams, secret crushes, confessions of foolishness and hope. Jephthah's daughter listened well and told her own stories, threading them through the group like beads on a necklace. "I always thought I'd see the sea," she confessed with a wistful grin, "or taste honey straight from the comb, not just the market. Life is never quite what you bargain for, is it?" The others shook their heads, and one laughed. "Well, at least we got these mountains and each other." They sang songs, sometimes sad, sometimes triumphant, voices echoing off the hills like a prayer set free. No one hushed the tears, and no one hid the giggles that came on silly days. If courage has a sound, here it was, a harmony of longing, gratitude, and stubborn joy blooming even in the shadow of farewell. Under a roof of sky, the friends found ways to hold sorrow and celebration in the same hand. The girls who had once played in the dust of Gilead now wove their own rituals, dancing barefoot on stony trails, braiding wildflowers into their hair, sharing every meal as if each bite might be a memory to treasure. 2 months unfurled this way, tears that watered laughter, and laughter that made even the hardest goodbyes gentle. In the hills, sorrow did not win by silencing joy. Instead, it became another kind of music, one these friends would carry. Year after year, whenever the wind rustled through almond trees, or memories crept quietly back at dusk, as the days on the hills ripened and lengthened, Jephthah's daughter and her friends found their own ways to honor the time they'd been given. At night, they made a small fire beneath the open sky, stars flickering above like scattered pearls. The air brimmed with the gentle hush of girls growing quietly brave together. It became their ritual. After the evening meal, they'd gather in a loose circle, knees drawn up, sharing stories about the futures they once imagined of gardens, laughter, maybe a small cottage, perhaps even a wild adventure or two. "I thought I'd marry a fisherman and spend my days arguing about the best way to gut a carp," one friend joked, making the rest giggle. Another admitted she'd hoped for children who would be loud and stubborn, just like her. There was honest melancholy, but no bitterness, only the sweet sting of what could have been and the deep comfort of not being alone in it. Jephthah's daughter listened, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent, tracing paths in the dust with her fingertip. "I wanted to grow old with stories worth telling," she confessed one starlit evening, her voice no louder than the breeze. "Now I see we're living them right here." The friends nodded, understanding that this quiet gathering, this tender bravery would outlast almost anything else they could have wished for. On cool nights, they wrapped themselves in shared cloaks, pointing out constellations and making up new names for them. That one's the laughing goat, someone declared. And over there, the basket of undone chores. They laughed until they nearly fell asleep beneath their own little universe of inside jokes. When dawn pushed gold through the grass, the girls sometimes walked in silence, arms linked, letting the hush fill the spaces sorrow once claimed. They spoke of next steps, small dreams, how to honor memory with more joy than regret. If you listen close, whispered Jephthah's daughter, the morning has songs for those who pay attention. Their nights under the stars, rich with candor and gentle joy, became their way of saying goodbye, just to childhood or dreams, but to fear itself. And in those gentle rituals, with wild time at their feet and loyalty in their laughter, they built a memory strong enough to last through even the hardest days ahead. Back in Gilead, time slowed to the pace of waiting. Every morning, Jephthah stood at the threshold of his door, eyes searching the distant hills, as if longing alone might bring his daughter home faster. His house, once filled with the noise of quick feet and sudden laughter, echoed with a hush that neither victory nor neighbors could breach. He tried to keep busy repairing the fence, tending the embers in the hearth, trading idle talk with those who passed by, but nothing shook free the persistent ache beneath his ribs. Even the village, which had found so much to celebrate in the days after the battle, now moved gently around his sorrow, uncertain how to help a man who had given everything and now waited for the one thing he could not reclaim. At night, Jephthah would count the stars through a narrow window, remembering stories his daughter used to spin about each constellation. The memories stung, but he let them stay, not chasing them away. Once or twice, overcome by the quiet, he whispered her name just to fill the silence, just to remind himself that love, though bruised, was still real. Sometimes children would come by and peek at the house, curious about the quietness there, but even they sensed something sacred in his vigil. A neighbor might leave a basket of bread on the steps, no note attached, the simple kindness saying more than words could carry. Days you hope never to see have a way of stretching for Jephthah. These days felt endless, stitched together by waiting and longing, held up only by stubborn faith and the hope that grief's edge might be gentled by the return of a daughter's smile. And so Jephthah waited, not just marking time, but holding space for promise, sorrow, and a strange new peace that grew in the quiet peace born from having loved greatly, lost deeply, and still believing that every ending, however sharp, is shaped by all the love that came before it. At the end of 2 long months, a hush descended over Gilead, the kind that carries both the ache of goodbye and the hope of homecoming. From the edge of the hills, Jephthah's daughter returned, her friends close behind, faces touched by the sun, laughter gentled by wisdom, and sorrow gathered like wildflowers woven into their hair. She walked with quiet certainty, not rushing, as if each step was a prayer, for her father, for her friends, for herself. The girls who had spent the summer on mountain trails followed, arms linked, heads held high, their closeness a shield against fear. Neighbors watched from windows and doorways, unsure whether to rejoice or weep. Even those who had doubted or whispered cruelties in winters past now felt the gravity of the moment, how rare it was to witness courage this gentle, or acceptance this unflinching. Jephthah stood at the gate, his heart thundering with a hope too tender to name. When he saw his daughter, he felt his knees weaken, though he stayed upright by sheer stubbornness. She ran the last few steps, and for one sacred moment, father and daughter were locked in an embrace that contained everything words could never carry: apology, gratitude, grief, and love, pressed together until nothing lay between them but the honesty of tears. He clung to her as though he could somehow press years of protection into this one final hold. "My precious child," he whispered, voice roughened by longing and pride. "You return braver than I ever hoped, and more beautiful than any vow could steal away." She only smiled, eyes damp but shining. "I am home, father. I kept my word, and I am not afraid. Now let us see your promise honored with dignity, not regret." Around them, the village was silent, bearing witness not just to sacrifice, but to the unbreakable bond that had carried both through the wildest sorrow the world could conjure. And in that long embrace, beneath a sky vast with memory and unrealized dreams, something whole, something holy returned home as well. On the appointed day, the village gathered quietly, a circle of faces drawn in both awe and mourning. There was no festival, no parade, just the hush of hearts bearing witness, the way the world falls still for sacred things. Jephthah and his daughter stood together at the center, hand in hand, a father and child facing the cost of a promise, spoken too hastily, yet honored with a courage that would cause even the heavens to pause. His daughter wore white, her hair gently braided, no bow for celebration, but a crown of wildflowers woven by her friends. She looked steady, more calm than anyone expected her, gentle dignity that softened every gaze. Jephthah stood beside her, every line of his face marked by both pride and devastation. He did not try to speak grand words. Instead, he held her hand tightly, letting their silence say what centuries of storytellers could never quite capture. Here was love that could not be measured, a faith tested beyond logic, an ending that belonged to neither guilt nor glory but to grace. A quiet prayer drifted up on the breeze, not from a priest, but from one of the old women's syllables meant for comfort, meant to help sorrow pass gently through every heart gathered there. Jephthah's daughter bowed her head, letting the words settle over her like the evening dew. When it was time, she stepped forward unflinching, whole, carrying the vow into fulfillment the way she had carried joy as a little girl, straight-backed, unafraid, certain that sacrifice meant keeping not only a father's word, but a family's honor. No one interrupted. The hush was deep as blessing. Her friends wept, but softly, knowing the time for protests had passed, replaced now by reverence. Even the youngest children stood silent, their quick minds learning something about the price and power of spoken words. The offering was made quietly, with grace, not spectacle. Jephthah turned away, with tears falling open and unhidden, mourning his child and the man he once was, even as the story rippled through the village's story that would echo every time a promise hung heavy in the air and someone wondered what love and faith could truly cost. The crowd did not disperse in a rush. They lingered, held by the dignity of one girl's choice and the solemn hush of a vow kept, watching the sun slip below the hills, each heart gentled by loss, by awe, and by a sorrow that, even at its sharpest, held the soft edges of something sacred. The days that followed in Gilead were quieter, as if the village itself understood that certain wounds cannot be hurried or spoken about too loudly. People moved a little slower, voices softened, and even the hum of daily chores seemed wrapped in respect. In homes and on street corners, Jephthah's daughter was remembered not with idle gossip, but with a kind of gentle mourning that edged toward reverence. Mothers told their children the story in whispers, how a girl's courage honored both her father's word and her own bright spirit. Old men, who'd lost the taste for boasting, shook their heads softly, muttering, "You won't see her like again any time soon." And the girls of Gilead, who had watched every step of her journey, held each other tighter at dusk, finding in her memory the fragile beginnings of strength. Not all sorrow wore the same face. Jephthah carried his with a dignity that almost fooled the eye, but the hollowness never left his eyes. People brought him bread, offered company without making demands for conversation, and gave his grief space to settle. There were no lectures, no attempts to cheer him, only presence, and the respectful silence of those who know that sometimes the bravest thing is simply to remain. Some neighbors lit lamps in their windows at sundown, a quiet homage. Others planted a wildflower or two near her resting place, letting the petals speak where words would only falter. Stories of the vow and its cost passed gently from house to house, each telling softening details too harsh for bedtime, each memory weaving her name into the fabric of community. Life pressed forward, as it always must, but the memory of Jephthah's daughter softened the edges of every boast, every vow, every careless word. In the space left behind, families found reason to honor what could not be changed, and the whole village learned that sometimes even the hardest grief is best kept not just in one heart, but shared and shaded together beneath the olive trees and the unending sky. In the seasons that followed, something quiet but extraordinary took root among the young women of Israel. Each year, when the hills first turned olive and gold, the daughters of the land would gather together, slipping away from kitchens and chores, leaving behind the ordinary bustle of goats and market banter. They climbed the gentle slopes beyond Gilead, or wandered shaded valleys, for days set aside for memory and promise. They sang songs, some solemn, some sweet, and others with the kind of laughter that won't be quieted by sorrow. They told stories, not just of Jephthah's daughter, but of all who had faced hard choices and met them with unshaken dignity. They braided wildflowers into one another's hair, crafting garlands that glowed against the dusk, and each girl took her turn to remember aloud. She was brave, she was kind, she kept her father's word. These gatherings became a custom, and each year the story wound itself tighter into the heart of Israel. Mothers would watch their daughters go, pride blooming in their eyes and aching a little, too, at all that it meant. Even the smallest girls, who understood only that it was a day for walking and song, soon learned that faith was stitched from both joy and sadness, and that some stories are too precious to be lost to forgetfulness. For those 4 days, laughter and grief found strange harmony. The hills echoed with a music that was gentle and fierce, with secrets pressed into the earth and promises whispered under the open sky. And when the girls finally returned home, sun-warmed and tired, something strong went with them, the knowledge that courage need not always wear armor, and that memory, when kept tenderly, can shape a people long after the sharpest sorrow is past. So the legacy of Jephthah's daughter was carried on year by year, in the voices and hearts of Israel's daughters, a vow remembered, a grief honored, and a hope quietly reborn, always between the songs and the sunset. And so our story drifts to rest, the last echoes of Jephthah's vow settling into dusk like olive leaves on calm earth. What began in desperation, a promise, forced through clenched teeth, ended not just in sorrow, but in courage that moved quietly through generations. There are wounds, yes, and words we wish we could recall, but there is also hope, sturdy and persistent, pushing up through the scars like wildflowers after rain. In Gilead, people learned to speak more carefully, to love more openly, and to honor the mysteries they could never untangle. Jephthah's daughter became more than a name carried on the wind. She became a quiet reminder that faith, even when costly, holds room for both tears and tenderness. Maybe we are all a bit like Jephthah, sometimes blinded by fear, pressed by circumstances, throwing hope into heaven on a promise we barely understand. And maybe, if we look closely, we'll see that grace finds us, even in our deepest regrets, transforming what's broken into stories that help someone else stand up straight. So if you ever find yourself at the edge of a hard decision, or if the weight of old words presses too heavy, remember this: kindness ripples further than regret, and even the harshest vows can become seeds of blessing if tended with humility and love. As night falls over Gilead's hills once more, may you carry with you the quiet strength of those who walk ahead, the gentle courage of those who stay behind, and the resilient grace that can be found, sometimes, in the least expected places. Rest well, friend. The story keeps, and so does hope.